Hey, I'm Nathaniel. So today I wanted to talk about one of the most prominent subgenres of pop punk from the late 2000s, and one of my favorite types of pop punk that I was really into back in high school. And I was curious to explore some questions like how exactly should this style of music be defined, and what is its history, and how did it come about, and why was its popularity so short-lived, and to what extent does it still appeal to people today? While not everybody agrees that this subgenre should actually even be a thing, those who do believe that neon pop punk or neon pop is a subgenre of pop punk that developed in the mid-2000s largely out of scene culture, and which is defined musically by its use of synthesizers, its power pop influence hooks, and an emphasis overall on the poppier side of pop punk, which itself is a blend of pop music and punk rock. Neon pop punk was most popular in the late 2000s, and the trend had mostly gone away by the early 2010s. And just a few prominent examples of some bands that are associated with neon pop punk include All Time Low, Boys Like Girls, Hey Monday, We the Kings, Cobra Starship, The Cab, Metro Station, Forever the Sickest Kids, and The Maine. There are arguably a couple of distinct approaches to the subgenre, as there were some bands that were more synthesizer heavy and had less pop punk and rock influence like Cobra Starship, Cash Cash, and Metro Station, while there were other bands like All Time Low, Hey Monday, and We the Kings who retained the use of rock band instruments with fewer synthesizers and were more power pop influenced, often using big melodic hooks in their sound. The label neon probably comes from these bands' common use of bright colors in their overall image and branding, including how the band members commonly dressed, as well as on their album art and the subgenre's generally upbeat and bright sound, while the use of bright colors probably comes from its association with scene culture, which the genre is associated with, and which in turn likely borrowed this aesthetic from the bright colors commonly associated with rave culture. And by the way, based on Google search data and my own personal experience, it doesn't seem like that neon pop or neon pop punk were terms that were commonly being used until much more recently, and at the time, bands with a neon pop sound were mainly categorized more broadly using labels such as emo pop, which seems to refer in this case to pretty much any blending of emo and scene culture associated aesthetics with elements of pop, although emo pop can also have more specific definitions and refer to certain waves of bands like Fall Out Boy and Panic at the Disco. And the earliest reference that I could find to neon pop or neon pop punk was an article by Alt Press, which only dates back to 2016. But even if it is a retroactive label, I still think it does refer to a real sound and trend that clearly existed back in the mid to late 2000s. And scene culture, which is known in particular for its distinct fashion sense, and was influenced primarily by the emo culture that preceded it, but also by other subcultures to varying degrees, like the previously mentioned rave culture, was influential on a number of styles that developed around the time and which varied significantly in style, ranging from heavier and more aggressive styles like deathcore to more electronic and hip-hop influenced styles like electronicore and crunkcore to more accessible styles like emo pop and neon pop punk, and the latter which is arguably the most accessible manifestation of scene culture in music. And I would also argue that the neon pop sound can also be heard in some scene-associated styles that were mentioned like electronicore and crunkcore, such as in some songs by Breathe Carolina, I See Stars, and I Set My Friends on Fire. So the exact musical origins of the genre are not totally clear, although it does seem to have been fully developed by 2006, which is the first year that several prominent artists of the genre like Here's What We Aim For and Boys Like Girls first put out their debut albums The Same Old Blood Rush with a New Touch and Boys Like Girls. And even prior to the existence of the genre, there were already many bands who were pushing pop punk into a poppier direction in the mainstream. And maybe this is just my opinion, but it seemed like that with each wave of pop punk bands from the 90s through the mid-2000s that got popular, that each wave of new bands were poppier than the last. First with Green Day and The Offspring in the mid-1990s, who were fairly melodic but still had many of the stylistic qualities of punk rock. And then with bands like Blink-182 and New Found Glory in the late 90s to early 2000s, who kind of retained a punk edge but overall were more polished in their production and with a greater emphasis on catchy hooks. And then after that with bands like Good Charlotte and Simple Plan in the early to mid-2000s, who seemed, at least in my view, to be predominantly influenced by the poppier side of bands like Blink-182, but with maybe a slight edge to their sound and some rebellious lyrics. And I would argue their poppier approach somewhat resembles some aspects of the neon pop punk sound. So in my view, it seems like that bands with a neon pop punk sound were in part kind of a continuation of that, and also perhaps its logical conclusion, as the style really pushes the limits for what can be called pop punk and not just pop rock or even pop. And arguably many or even most of the artists associated with the neon pop punk sound don't really have any elements of punk rock at all most of the time, and seem to be almost exclusively influenced by the poppier side of pop punk. And this is reflected in aspects of the sound like the use of super polished production, an overall shift in vocal style away from the nasally and punk influenced vocals of many past pop punk bands toward a more emo and pop influenced vocal style, and also the use of lyrics which generally drop many of the rebellious past pop punk lyrics in favor of songs primarily about love and relationships. And this often often means that they're no more punk sounding than a typical pop rock band not associated with pop punk. And this relative distance from punk rock can make it somewhat controversial among some to associate the genre with pop punk at all. And I certainly understand the view that it should instead exist outside the genre of pop punk. That is, if you believe music with the pop punk label needs to have some sort of sonic or cultural connection to punk rock for the label to make sense. Though I would argue that one reason why the genre, at least for the most part, does make sense as a subgenre of pop punk is that how people overall understand pop punk as a genre has shifted and expanded over time, probably partly due to the popularity and influence of these poppier and poppier bands, as well as how pop punk's cultural connections have shifted from being tied mainly to punk culture, like how it seemed to be back in the 90s, to instead, by the end of the 2000s, being tied simultaneously to scene and emo culture. And so personally, despite the significant differences, I'm still comfortable calling everything from Green Day to We the Kings pop punk. And also, neon pop punk was also at the tail end of pop punk's popularity in the mainstream, as well as the mainstream popularity of rock music in general. And this style of music was not as popular overall as past approaches to the pop punk sound, or even as popular as some of the contemporary pop punk bands at the time, like Paramore and Fall Out Boy. Although bands like Boys Like Girls, Metro Station, and Cobra Starship did still have some mainstream success on music charts and on pop radio, mainly from around 2007 to 2009 when neon pop punk arguably was at its peak in popularity, while All Time Low seems to have had the biggest and most enduring fan base and continued success out of all these bands, which is actually kind of rare for the genre since many of these bands, and I suspect this is not uncommon among popular artists, simply seem to have more casual fans comparatively who seemed less invested in their music overall. The genre seemed to have mostly died out by the early 2010s, as many artists who previously made the style moved on to making other styles of music, like for example Cash Cash moving on to making electronic dance music, and then Boys Like Girls releasing a country pop album Crazy World in 2012. Then some bands went on hiatus or broke up, like in the case of Hey Monday, whose lead singer Cassidy Pope would go on to pursue a solo career also in country pop following her success on the singing competition show The Voice, while some other bands continue making similar music but simply declined in popularity, probably at least in part due to the continuing decline of rock music in the mainstream, as well as neon pop arguably being more of a fad that kind of played itself out fairly quickly, which people grew tired of and maybe was lacking somewhat in characteristics that people could deeply resonate with and could identify with. However, as mentioned before, All Time Low has continued to have a lot of success, with their song Monsters in 2020 being their most popular song of all time, and it does seem like that a lot of their recent stuff still retains the neon pop punk sound, while the band 5 Seconds of Summer were successful in the 2010s and they had some neon pop influenced songs. So I think that even if its influence was limited and its heyday was relatively short-lived, the genre has more than demonstrated its resilience as an enduring style of music that continues to appeal to people and which is looked back on at least somewhat fondly, which is evidenced by its consistent presence at the When We Were Young festival, and I expect it will continue to influence current and future artists, at least to some degree. Alright, well, that's it for me. Thank you for watching, and if you like this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to my channel. Then also leave a comment if you have any thoughts or opinions about this style of music, or if there are any particular artists or songs you like. Alright, well, thank you so much, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.